Hey, how are you doing, AOC community? My name is Tyler, and I will be your host for today's episode. And I am thrilled to introduce my co-host, Ashley, Cassidy, and Ashley. Today's episode will be focused on addiction. Starting this episode off, I would firstly like to acknowledge this beautiful land that we work, live, and play on. We are on the unceded territory of the Nanaimo people, with a broadcasting range that overlaps the Kowatsin and Slayamon territories. This acknowledgement is done with gratitude to the Nanaimo people and with the intention to increase awareness about truth and reconciliation processes and the efforts on Vancouver Island. Additional information and resources surrounding Nanaimo history, reconciliation, protocol, and land acknowledgement can be found on our Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube pages. I will be stating that we are providing information from reliable sources, and all information is for educational purposes only. The information in this episode does not replace the advice of your primary healthcare professional. Getting started, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about addiction? Is it someone who's experiencing lack of housing? Is it someone who smokes or vapes? Or is it your sibling who chronically scrolls on TikTok? With these thoughts in mind, let's define addiction. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the definition of addiction is a compulsive, chronic, physiological, or psychological need for a habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity, having harmful, physical, psychological, or social effects, and typically cause well-defined symptoms such as anxiety, irritability, tremors, or nausea upon withdrawal or abstinence. With this definition in mind, we want to ask our community at VIU what their definition of addiction is, and any other thoughts they may have. Please welcome our very own VIU community. What is your definition of addiction?
My definition of addiction is a dependence on a substance.
Okay, and what are some types of addictions that you are aware of?
Opioid addiction, alcohol addiction, addiction to social media, addictions to sugar, addictions to unhealthy people.
In your opinion, how do you think a person develops an addiction?
In my experience, addiction has been developed because of a traumatic event and the inability to cope with that traumatic event.
Excellent.
Leads you to substance use, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what are some challenges someone may face when stopping an addiction?
Stigma, lack of access to resources, lack of support.
And do you think there is a stigma surrounding someone who has an addiction? If so, why?
Absolutely. It's something that we don't talk about as a whole. It's very triggering. We don't talk about it in government enough that as we should. We don't talk about it in school. We don't talk about it with our families. There's a lot of shame based around it. Yeah, so definitely there's a lot of stigma surrounding addiction, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what addiction resources are you familiar with here in Nanaimo?
I know that there are treatment centers like Edgewood. I know that there have been safe injection sites. I don't know if they're still in operation. I know that there's outreach workers. And I know that we have the hospital for anyone that's like in serious crisis.
Mm-hmm. Great. Excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what's your definition of addiction?
I would say my definition of addiction is can't live without something. Like it impacts their daily life. And it's like a kind of like a physiological need for it, and like need to carry on throughout the day.
And what are some types of addictions you're aware of?
There's drug addiction, there's exercise addiction, phone addiction, sex addiction, anything that like release like dopamine or anything in your body or brain.
Mm-hmm. Just like a quick dopamine release.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in your opinion, how do you think a person develops an addiction?
I think people can be, first of all, predisposed based on family history to addiction, but as well, it's like you are lacking some kind of stimuli and then you're trying to find it any way possible.
What are some challenges someone may face when stopping an addiction?
Finding resources and support, trying to find a way to fill the hole that their addiction is leaving. them when they're not able to use that anymore.
And do you think there is a stigma surrounding someone who has an addiction? If so, why?
I think there is a large stigma. I mean, as much as we talk about there isn't a stigma, there's still a stigma. People have predisposed ideas of why someone has an addiction and thinks they can just like handle it, but it takes actually a lot of support. So I think it's still something that has to be worked on as a society.
I agree. And what are some addiction resources you're familiar with here in Nanaimo?
I don't think I actually know that many. Like a lot of things I would just go to online. I would probably like do some Googling and then hopefully find a therapist and like someone who can refer me then to better options, but I don't know any off the top of my head.
Okay. So some resources here in Nanaimo are the Mental Health and Addiction Services on Barons Road, the Edgewood Treatment Center on Boxwood Road, and ARC Addictions and Recovery Clinic on Victoria Road. Well, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
What's your definition of addiction?
I would define addiction just as someone being dependent on something. Like they can't live without it in a way. They feel like they need it and it will affect their like day-to-day lives if they don't have it.
Mm-hmm, definitely. What are some types of addictions that you're aware of?
Drug addiction, gambling addiction, sex addiction, exercise addiction.
And in your opinion, how do you think a person develops an addiction?
That's a hard question. I think they're definitely like she said, they are lacking some sort of stimulant in their life. And if they have something that releases that dopamine rush, they can easily get addicted to it. Not really sure.
Yeah, definitely kind of like trying to fill a void.
Yeah.
What are some challenges someone may face stopping an addiction?
Not having a good support system can be really hard as well, or trying to find resources in their community. There might not be that many as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or easily accessible.
Yeah.
So do you think there is stigma surrounding someone who has an addiction? If so, why?
I do. I think some people, I've heard them say they don't believe in addiction. They're like, oh, you can just stop doing it. But they don't understand that like it'll really affect the person like physically and mentally if they stop it. So yeah, I think that's a big stigma.
Yeah, I agree. So what are some addiction resources that you are familiar with here in Nanaimo?
I'm actually not too sure. I know that there is a rehabilitation center in Nanaimo. I'm not sure the name of it, but yeah, that's all I'm aware of really.
Yeah, so I can tell you some. So we have the Nanaimo Mental Health and Addiction Services, which is on Barons Road. We have the Edgewood Treatment Center, which is on Boxwood, and the ARC Addictions and Recovery Clinic, which is on Victoria Road.
Cool.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So what is your definition of addiction?
I think addiction is something that you need in your everyday life. Like it's something you're dependent on and you can't like live without it.
And so what are some types of addictions that you are aware of?
I think the two like main ones would be like alcohol and drugs, but then of course there's like it could be like work or like school, like that kind of stuff too.
So in your opinion, how do you think a person develops an addiction?
Maybe they get like too much of it and then they just become dependent on it. Like they can't process like anything without that like substance or something.
Yeah. What would you say are some challenges someone may face when stopping an addiction?
I think having like the proper resources to help stop it is really important, and some people like might lack that in life.
Do you think there is a stigma surrounding someone who has an addiction? And if so, why do you think that?
I think so. Like I think it should be like people think it's probably pretty easy to get over it, but in reality, like it takes time, like it takes longer, it takes lots of support and resources to get over it.
Yeah, for sure. What addiction resources are you familiar with here in Nanaimo?
I actually have no idea. I know none of them.
That's fair. So a few are the Nanaimo Mental Health and Addiction Services on Barons Road. There's the Edgewood Treatment Center on Boxwood Road, and ARC Addictions and Recovery Clinic on Victoria Road. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
What is your definition of addiction?
That's a good question. It comes in so many different forms and shapes. It's doing something that's not good, I believe, for you, and the inability to stop doing it.
Yeah, definitely. What are some types of addictions that you're aware of?
Yeah, so there's drug addiction, but there's also other things like sexual addiction, and there'd be addiction to like video games and stuff like that as well, right? I can't think of any right now. I'm trying to think.
That's okay. There's a lot. So in your opinion, how do you think a person develops an addiction?
So in a response to stress, I believe, a lot of people who have an addiction have had, I think it's predominantly people who have had a bad childhood. That's my understanding. And then it manifests itself later on as a teenager or young adult. They go through stressors, and then their way of coping, they haven't had coping mechanisms really effective in their youth, and so then they turn to addiction in their adult life.
Yeah,
it's
I agree.
Unhealthy way of coping.
So what are some challenges someone may face trying to stop an addiction?
Well, for one, they're shame-based. Addictions are not something that we're allowed to talk about in our society. And so if you have an addiction and you want to get help, often you have to give some time away from a job or your social connections. You need to back away from them. They need an explanation. Coming up with an explanation that is something that will be accepted and not full of shame is really hard. The other thing is it costs money a lot of the time to have help, to go to like a center. And the other thing is, a lot of times when you're struggling with addiction, you have a pre-existing condition, then like ADHD, for example, where it's really hard for you to find the resource and do the follow through and continue on pursuing that until you get a positive result. You just give up. So you try, you have all this motivation, and then you just give up because you're not getting the answers that you need.
Yeah, it can be really difficult.
Yeah.
Do you think there is stigma surrounding someone who has an addiction? And if so, why?
Yeah, 100% there is stigma. People don't have an understanding of where the addiction comes from. Why do these people have the addiction? So they don't have empathy for them, but they have judgment. And so you might say, as a classic example, someone who is on drugs and on the street, people say, just get a job. And they don't realize what kind of things they're struggling with at home that make it so they can't get a job, or they can't find help to get a job. They really need to have a helping hand.
Yeah, that's one actually that I've heard too. Just go get a job. That's quite common. Yeah.
Just stop.
Yeah, it's definitely not that simple.
Not so easy.
Yeah. So what addiction resources are you familiar with here in Nanaimo?
Well, you can go to your family doctor. And if you go into an ER, urgent care place, they will also give you a list of places that you could go. I know of one up, I don't know the name of the road, off Northfield.
Is that the Barons Road? No?
No. It's kind of where the gas station is, going towards the highway. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a treatment center there. I know there are treatment centers all down as far as like Cobble Hill. But and then there's walk-in clinics. And there's one behind the mall with Yisk, in the back of the Yisk.
Oh, yeah.
There's a treatment center
there.
That's Barons Road. Okay.
Oh, and downtown, you can go in and talk to a counselor beside the Chinese buffet restaurant.
Yeah, that mental health building. Yeah. I think that was one of the ones I was going to bring up with you. There's also the Edgewood Treatment Center and ARC Addictions and Recovery Clinic. That one's on Victoria Road. Those are just some, not all of them. But thank you. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no worries.
And if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM.
So what's your definition of addiction?
Addiction is when a behavior or the use of something starts to negatively impact your life and you can't really seem to stop it despite the effect that it's having on your life.
What are some types of addiction that you're aware of?
There can be gambling, there can be addiction to drugs, there can be addiction to shopping. Basically, you can be addicted to anything.
And in your opinion, how do you think a person develops an addiction?
I think a person is at more risk for developing an addiction based on their, any traumatic experiences they have, or if their family is suffering from addiction, or if they've been shown addiction in their life, or a lot of times people don't have those experiences and just try, particularly a drug, and they just sort of full tilt go into it.
And what are some challenges you think someone might face when facing addiction or when stopping addiction?
I know that there's a big lack of resources, so many people with addiction that want to quit can't quit due to there's no place for them to go into treatment, or they can't just go into it right away. I know that if you want to go into rehab, a lot of the times a requirement for going into rehab is to detox, and they can get a detox bed, but then there's a lot of time in between before they can get into rehab. And that, again, just points to lack of resources.
And do you think there's a stigma surrounding someone who has an addiction? And if so, why?
Of course there's a stigma, because a lot of people in addiction are taking up a lot of resources of our city, or their destruction of property, or the crime rate increases when people are associated with addiction, trying to feed their habits. So it becomes a basically blight on the general population.
And what addiction resources are you familiar with in Nanaimo?
I know that there's Clearview, I think it's called. So there's a detox center. There are resources through the Salvation Army, and I think the police can set up some resources. I'm not sure exactly what they're called. I know there's Barron's Road. Not exactly sure of all of the particular resources, but I know there are some.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Barron's Road, mm-hmm. That one's a good one. Mm-hmm. Definitely a area where growth could be added. So thank you so much for your time. That was great.
Wow, what a studious group of students. That was amazing. So here's a full list of addiction resources here in Nanaimo. We have the Edgewood Treatment Center at 2121 Boxwood Road, Mental Health and Substance Use Center at 3151 Barron's Road, One Life Recovery Society at 304 Wallace Street, Arc Addictions and Recovery at 55 Victoria Street, Suite 200, True Beginnings Clinic, 55 Victoria Road, and finally, Clearview Detox Center located at 967 Halliburton Street. Links and addresses to all these resources will be posted on our social media and YouTube pages. Moving forward with the episode, I would like to introduce someone who has had experience in the field of addiction. Their story is inspiring, and the work they have done has helped countless. This person is none other than Dr. Paxie Vreedie. Although she is retired in 2010, she has worked with struggling women, as well as donated her time at the first methadone clinics here in town. Please welcome Dr. Paxie Vreedie.
Thank you for being on the show with us. Do you mind giving us some history and introduce yourself a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, my name is Dr. Paxie Vreedie. And I'm now 10 years retired, but I've been a GP in Nanaimo in the past, between 93 until 2013. And before that, I worked in Vancouver. I actually went to UBC, but much earlier. I originally come from Holland. I grew up in Holland, went to school there and to high school, and went to university and went to medical school initially in Holland. Graduated in 1983 and decided to do family medicine rather than specialty because I had a 7-year-old son. And there for a 16-year-old daughter, and they had been seeing little enough of their mother. So, and I actually really enjoyed being a family physician, doing a lot of deliveries and doing a lot of special things. And I've enjoyed coming to Nanaimo once my children were actually in university and on their own. I was able to work in a smaller place where medicine was more interesting, actually.
So what led you to get into addictions counseling and treatment?
Partially at UBC, in my practical work there, I already came into contact with the, to me, surprising amount of drug addiction. I was familiar with the fact that a certain percentage of our population tends to become alcoholics, and I was a little, but in terms of drug addiction, that was already much more prevalent than I would have expected coming from Holland. In my second year, we did a month and a half practical experience with a family doctor in the boonies, and I went up to Port McNeill and had a fabulous experience there. But I was astounded. I thought, okay, a faraway community. I was astounded at the amount of drug abuse that was, or drug use, or that was even present there. That was the exposure, and therefore learning about it, not very extensively, but learning about it was part of our curriculum already. Later on, and already in Vancouver, there came a time that I realized that there were patients in my practice who would really benefit from methadone treatment. And so I decided to do some special further education to get a methadone license. That required, doing special courses. And then later on in Nanaimo, in the last 10, 13 years of my practice, it became increasingly common to have significant and serious family difficulties because of one family member who had troubles with drug addiction. And that could be grandmothers who were looking after their grandchildren because their children were unable to do so because of their addiction, as well as mothers who had lost their children because they had been found to be addicted, and really extremely much more common. So and there was a tremendous lack of people who were of docs who wanted to get interested in knowing about and treating drug addicted people because it's difficult.
Yeah, totally. So what initially inspired you was the lack of doctors working in that area, or? No, the need on the part of my patients. Yeah. And once I wanted to slow down, and I was no longer doing deliveries, which had previously been a real joy in my life, and I wanted to do something else that was particularly necessary and needed. And so as I slowed down a bit in my practice, I added work in a methadone clinic in town. When starting your line, what were some learning curves you had to overcome?
I think the biggest one is learning to establishing trust with them is very, very difficult. And initially, especially their stories are very unreliable, and to start to find the balance between accepting what they're saying as if it is the truth, and being sufficiently aware that you can actually not trust anything.
Right.
And being okay with that is hard. That's probably the most difficult thing.
And so what strategies did you use to foster that trusting relationship?
Well, talking to my mentor in the clinic, but also trying to find where there might be some common ground, some common interest, and finding where there are value systems in your client that are important to them, and becoming interested in those and working through that bit of common normal place to gain trust and make them feel more at ease with the fact that they're not being only the druggie.
Yeah.
They're a person.
Yeah, seeing them for who they are and establishing that rapport with them.
Yes.
Yeah. So with helping them work through their addictions, how do you address a dual diagnosis of a possible co-occurring mental health disorder with your clients?
The possible mental health disorder is so common that it is just really almost always there. A lot of drug addiction actually comes out of the fact that as younger teenagers, they have already started to use marijuana and other drugs as a way of treating their anxiety. And especially, and therefore become friendly with their drug dealer, trust them a lot, and the fact that there is another diagnosis is very often one of the most difficult things for especially younger people with a significant mental health diagnosis, schizophrenia especially, and also especially bipolar disease, is to stay on their medications. And it's especially difficult to do that when the stresses increase, and when they start to feel better, they are all too soon ready to say, no, I don't need it anymore. Then when they stop their medications, going back to the doctor is really difficult because they have not followed doctor's orders.
Yeah.
But their drug dealer will be only too happy to initially, if they have been clean in the meantime, initially just give them a little gift, a little treat, and then pretty soon have them hooked again.
Do you mind elaborating further? Like, how would you prevent that relapse from happening, like from your end?
That is still the most difficult part of the treatment of drug addiction, and it is very, very, very rare that anybody will anyone who has been addicted for more than 2 or 3 years might be detoxed, but nobody is ever cured after detox. Might go to a good longer term, call it re-education or support and further treatment program, of which, at least at the time that I was still practicing, we have far too few really good options. There's, I think, anything less than 6 months usually is not sufficient. It is just not sufficient to give enough opportunity to rebuild the trust of the person in themselves, to find out what their chances are to start to engage in a job opportunity that is one that they like doing, that fits their abilities and their qualifications. Fine for them to find that healthy habits of exercise and of other self-care things actually do help when they start to have cravings, and they will have cravings. There will be even after 6 months, even after a year, there will be sudden circumstances that will give them cravings, and to have them become really good at saying, I think I need to make sure that I am starting to do some more of my other things. And so it takes somebody else to also be able to see that they're sliding, that they're sliding off, and say, hey, come on. So it is follow up, as much as you can give them. And in that follow-up, emphasize the positive steps that they've been making, and forgive slips, and just get on the wagon again.
Yeah. So just like really use a strength-based approach.
Yes. Strength building and resilience building is, I guess, a short way to say it.
Wow. So,
making sure their rewards are there.
Totally, yeah. So in your opinion, what are the most significant challenges or barriers individuals face when seeking support? And how do you address these challenges?
There are challenges in themselves.
Yeah.
And those are the shame. They've been hiding something for a long time from friends, from family, from sometimes their employer. And so it takes courage to realize. And so it often, certainly from alcoholics, it's always been known they have to hit rock bottom, and then because there's a long time that they believe themselves that they can stop whenever they want to, but that doesn't quite work out so much. So that's in themselves. Then there is also the other things in terms of teenagers and young adults as well. They have often been lying to their parents. They may have been stealing from their parents, having to face up to these kind of things. Other cases, they're already from before in conflict with their parents, and so they have no family support. There is a lot of stigma still attached. And there's also a shortage of centers where someone can go and say, I need help. And that's why safe injection sites and other so-called harm-reducing centers, methadone clinics, can be a place where yes, they aren't immediately cured of their addictions, but they can be gradually weaned, and one can work at building.
100%. It's also a really good way for the healthcare workers to be engaged with people.
Yes, absolutely.
Are addicted, and that's a really good way of building trust, I think.
Yes.
Excellent. And then can you elaborate further on these harm reduction sites and how they support the addiction? I know I just said the trusting is built, but
Tyler, as I said earlier, I've been out of the loop now, so I don't know how many we have anymore in Nanaimo. I don't keep up to date with it anymore. Mm-hmm. I know there are some people who do extremely good work in that direction. I read that we had a safe injection site that was volunteer staffed, but that at some stage during COVID had to give up because of just not being able to have enough personnel or whatever. If you look at what is happening in downtown, then you know that we're really way too short. Mm-hmm. And the homelessness and homelessness years of, I'm sorry to have to say it, but years of neglect of mental health care and sufficient resources for mental health care, years of neglect. Because 10 years ago I was working in a methadone clinic, and we were having overdoses from our clients, mm-hmm. or a client would come in and one of their friends had died from an overdose. Long before that, that they were being tabulated or that they were being advertised, we had way too many young people already then dying from overdoses.
Wow.
But it was being buried, and nobody wanted to hear about it, and nobody wanted to know about it.
Mm-hmm. Just kind of pushed under the rug.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, it's sad.
Just like families are ashamed of their drug-addicted family members, I think provinces and communities are ashamed of the fact that they have people with drug addiction and that they have these overdoses. I think that they're now finally at least talking about it a lot more. There's still more talk than actual real...
Yeah, there's a lot of politics going on behind the scenes.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time and sharing all that information with us.
You're most welcome. I hope that it helps you and also your classmates to take an interest mm-hmm. in mental health and addiction, and to continue to act for getting people the help that they need. Yeah.
We will. We'll do our best.
That'd be great.
All right. Well, thank you, Paxie.
You're welcome.
Thank you again, Dr. Paxie Vreedie. One thing that was mentioned within the interview was childhood trauma. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Cassidy, and her segment on trauma.
Did you know there is a distinct correlation between adverse childhood experiences and addiction? Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, might include things like experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect, growing up in a household with mental health or substance use problems, or any other traumatic experience that might impact a child's health or well-being. The developing brain is profoundly vulnerable to trauma, and traumatic experiences in the formative years can have lasting effects through adulthood. Early adversity significantly impacts our brain, shaping how we see ourselves and the world around us. Childhood trauma can alter brain development and emotional regulation, making individuals more susceptible to addictive behaviors later in life. This link lies in the brain's response to stress. Early trauma can trigger the release of stress hormones, affecting the brain's reward and pleasure centers. This alteration can lead to risk-taking behaviors and a greater inclination towards substance use as a coping mechanism. Understanding this connection between adverse childhood experiences and addiction is pivotal for implementing effective prevention and intervention strategies. Trauma-informed care and therapies that address both the addiction and underlying traumatic experience are vital in breaking this cycle and fostering lasting recovery.
Thank you, Cassidy. A major topic posed within our interviews has been stigma. Well, what is stigma? According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, stigma is a set of negative and unfair beliefs that a society or group of people have about something. Let's break this down. In the article, The Impact of Stigma on People with Opiate Use Disorder, Opioid Treatment and Policy, written by Ali Cheatham, Louisa Pico, Dan Lubman, and Suzanne Nielsen, they refer to stigma in three interacting types: structural stigma, public stigma, and internalized stigma. Structural stigma is the enforcement of laws, policies, and practices put in place to discriminate a stigmatized group. An example of this would be the war on drugs that was started by President Nixon in the 1970s and boomed with President Reagan's extreme policies in the 80s. Public stigma are the stereotypes of individuals or groups provoking negative thoughts and feelings towards them. An example of this would be seeing a group of students and assuming they're all addicted to caffeine. And finally, self-stigma. Self-stigma is the negative thoughts and emotions one may feel when having these discriminatory practices placed on them. These negative feelings are very likely to result in decreased quality of life. When experiencing this stigma, people are more likely to avoid treatment, disassociate from others, and overall become more withdrawn from society. So what can we do to help? First, stop using slang terms such as addict, junkie, or druggie. Instead, use person-first language. An example of this would be person who uses drugs. When describing drug use, use neutral vocabulary, avoiding judgment. Just remember, addiction and substance misuse can happen to anyone. Let's do our best to support one another. For more information on words of stigma, the Government of Canada has a page detailing how to change your wording. A link will be posted on our social media and YouTube pages. Moving on with today's episode, I'd like to introduce my co-host Ashley and her segment on smartphone use. Please welcome Ashley.
Thanks, Tyler. So while we're on the subject of addictions, I'd like to bring up addiction that is so common in society right now, and that is our smartphones. This TED Talk consists of psychologist Adam Alter, who studies how much time screens steal from us and how they're getting away with it. He shares why all those hours you spend staring at your smartphone, your tablet, or computer might actually be making you miserable. And he also explains what you can do about it. So without further ado, here's the TED Talk.
So a few years ago, I heard an interesting rumor. Apparently, the head of a large pet food company would go into the annual shareholders meeting with a can of dog food, and he would eat the can of dog food. And this was his way of convincing them that if it was good enough for him, it was good enough for their pets. This strategy is now known as dog fooding, and it's a common strategy in the business world. Doesn't mean everyone goes in and eats dog food, but business people will use their own products to demonstrate that they feel that they're confident in them. Now, this is a widespread practice, but I think what's really interesting is when you find exceptions to this rule, when you find cases of businesses or people in businesses who don't use their own products. Turns out there's one industry where this happens in a common way, in a pretty regular way, and that is the screen-based tech industry. So in 2010, Steve Jobs, when he was releasing the iPad, described the iPad as a device that was extraordinary, the best browsing experience you ever had, way better than a laptop, way better than a smartphone. It's an incredible experience. Now, a couple of months later, he was approached by a journalist from the New York Times, and they had a long phone call. And at the end of the call, the journalist threw in a question that seemed like a sort of softball. He said to him, "Your kids must love the iPad." And there's an obvious answer to this, but what Jobs said really staggered the journalist. He was very surprised because he said, "They haven't used it. We limit how much technology our kids use at home." This is a very common thing in the tech world. In fact, there's a school quite near Silicon Valley called the Waldorf School of the Peninsula, and they don't introduce screens until the 8th grade. Now, what's really interesting about the school is that 75% of the kids who go there have parents who are high-level Silicon Valley tech execs. So when I heard about this, I thought it was interesting and surprising, and it pushed me to consider what screens were doing to me and to my family and the people I loved and to people at large. And so for the last 5 years, as a professor of business and psychology, I've been studying the effect of screens on our lives. And I want to start by just focusing on how much time they take from us. And then we can talk about what that time looks like. So what I'm showing you here is the average 24-hour workday at 3 different points in history. 2007, 10 years ago, 2015, and then data that I collected actually only last week. And a lot of things haven't changed all that much. So we sleep roughly 7.5 to 8 hours a day. Some people say that's declined slightly, but it hasn't changed much. We work 8.5 to 9 hours a day. We engage in survival activities. These are things like eating and bathing and looking after kids, about 3 hours a day. And that leaves this white space. That's our personal time. That space is incredibly important to us. That's the space where we do things that make us individuals. That's where hobbies happen, where we have close relationships, where we really think about our lives, where we get creative, where we zoom back and try to work out whether our lives have been meaningful. And of course, we get some of that from work as well, but when people look back on their lives and they wonder what their lives have been like at the end of their lives, you look at the last things they say, they are talking about those moments that happen in that white personal space. So it's sacred. It's important to us. Now, what I'm going to do is show you how much of that space is taken up by screens across time. In 2007, this much. That was the year that Apple introduced the first iPhone. 8 years later, this much. Now, this much.
And if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM.
That's how much time we spend of that free time in front of our screens. This yellow area, this thin sliver, is where the magic happens. That's where your humanity lives. And right now, it's in a very small box. So what do we do about this? Well, the first question is, what does that red space look like? Now, of course, screens are miraculous in a lot of ways. I live in New York. A lot of my family lives in Australia, and I have a 1-year-old son. And the way I've been able to introduce them to him is with screens. I couldn't have done that 15 or 20 years ago in quite the same way. So there's a lot of good that comes from them. And one thing you can do is you can ask yourself what goes on during that time. How enriching are the apps that we're using? And some are enriching. If you stop people while they're using them and say, tell us, how do you feel right now? They say they feel pretty good about these apps. Those that focus on relaxation, exercise, weather, reading, education, and health. They spend an average of 9 minutes a day on each of these. These apps make them much less happy. About half the people, when you interrupt them and say, how do you feel, say they don't feel good about using them. Now, what's interesting about these, dating, social networking, gaming, entertainment, news, web browsing, people spend 27 minutes a day on each of these. We're spending 3 times longer on the apps that don't make us happy. That doesn't seem very wise. Now, one of the reasons we spend so much time on these apps that make us unhappy is they rob us of stopping cues. Stopping cues were everywhere in the 20th century. They were baked into everything we did. A stopping cue is basically a signal that it's time to move on, to do something new, to do something different. And think about newspapers. Eventually you get to the end, you fold the newspaper away, you put it aside. The same with magazines, books, you get to the end of a chapter, prompts you to consider whether you want to continue. You watched a show on TV, eventually the show would end and then you'd have a week until the next one came. So there were stopping cues everywhere. But the way we consume media today is such that there are no stopping cues. The newsfeed just rolls on and everything's bottomless. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, email, text messaging, the news. And when you do check all sorts of other sources, you can just keep going on and on and on. So we can get a cue about what to do from Western Europe, where they seem to have a number of pretty good ideas in the workplace. Here's one example. This is a Dutch design firm. And what they've done is they've rigged the desks to the ceiling. And at 6 p.m. every day, it doesn't matter who you're emailing or what you're doing, the desks rise to the ceiling. 4 days a week, the space turns into a yoga studio. 1 day a week into a dance club. It's really up to you which ones you stick around for. But this is a great stopping rule, because it means that at the end of the day, everything stops. There's no way to work. At Daimler, the German car company, they've got another great strategy. When you go on vacation, instead of saying this person's on vacation, they'll get back to you eventually, they say this person's on vacation, so we've deleted your email. This person will never see the email you just sent. You can email back in a couple of weeks, or you can email someone else. And so you can imagine what that's like. You go on vacation and you're actually on vacation. The people who work at this company feel that they actually get a break from work. But of course, that doesn't tell us much about what we should do at home in our own lives. And so I want to make some suggestions. It's easy to say between, say, 5 and 6 p.m., I'm going to not use my phone. The problem is 5 and 6 p.m. looks different on different days. I think a far better strategy is to say, I do certain things every day. There are certain occasions that happen every day, like eating dinner. Sometimes I'll be alone, sometimes with other people, sometimes in a restaurant, sometimes at home. But the rule that I've adopted is I will never use my phone at the table. It's far away as possible. Because we're really bad at resisting temptation, but when you have a stopping cue that every time dinner begins, my phone goes far away, you avoid temptation altogether. At first, it hurts. I had massive FOMO. I struggled. But what happens is you get used to it. You overcome the withdrawal the same way you would from a drug. And what happens is life becomes more colorful, richer, more interesting. You have better conversations. You really connect with the people who are there with you. I think it's a fantastic strategy. And we know it works because when people do this, and I've tracked a whole lot of people who have tried this, it expands. They feel so good about it that they start doing it for the first hour of the day in the morning. They start putting their phones on airplane mode on the weekend. That way your phone remains a camera, but it's no longer a phone. It's a really powerful idea, and we know people feel much better about their lives when they do this. So what's the take home here? Screens are miraculous. I've already said that, and I feel that it's true. But the way we use them is a lot like driving down a really fast, long road. And you're in a car where the accelerator is mashed to the floor. It's kind of hard to reach the brake pedal, and you've got a choice. You can either glide by past, say, the beautiful ocean scenes and take snaps out the window, and that's the easy thing to do. Or you can go out of your way to move the car to the side of the road, to push that brake pedal, to get out, take off your shoes and socks, take a couple of steps onto the sand, feel what the sand feels like under your feet, walk to the ocean and let the ocean lap at your ankles. Your life will be richer and more meaningful because you breathe in that experience and because you've left your phone in the car. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Ashley. That was very interesting. I'll be sure to manage my time better on my smartphone. For our next topic, there has been a growing market within our society, initially with good intentions, but has now turned into a harmful, multi-billion-dollar industry. This industry being vaping or e-cigarettes. Vaping originated as a healthier alternative to smoking, but has become its own addiction entirely. Vapes are convenient, offer a multitude of appealing flavors, and have a cheap cost, enabling them to hook many young adults and teens on nicotine who may have never even touched a cigarette. With their promotion of a healthier alternative to smoking, vape juice still contains a long list of harmful chemicals. These chemicals being glycerol, artificial flavors, propylene glycol, and varying amounts of nicotine. When igniting a vape, a coil inside the device heats up and causes a reaction with the chemicals in the vape juice, producing the aerosol. This level of heat can cause contaminants from the coil to be burnt and mixed in with the aerosol, which is then inhaled into your lungs. With the rise of vape use, more of the side effects are being observed. There are still no long-term side effects at the moment, but research is being done. Some of the short-term side effects include lung irritation, which leads to swelling of the lungs and narrowing of the lung space, lung tissue scarring, which can lead to COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, organ damage to the lungs, heart, and brain, and increased blood pressure. With the increase of these short-term side effects, the American Lung Association has created a new acronym called EVALI. EVALI stands for e-cigarette or vaping use associated lung injury. With all this in mind, please say no to the vape, and if you already do vape, please think about some strategies to quit. With the harms of vaping and how addictive nicotine is, let's break down why nicotine is so addictive. First off, what is nicotine? According to psychologists Amir Rezvani and Edward Levin, nicotine is the principal psychoactive chemical in tobacco. Okay, what does that mean? Rezvani and Levin break down the nicotinic effects, stating that it increases cognition by releasing the hormones acetylcholine, glutamate, dopamine, adrenaline, serotonin, and Y-aminobutyric acid. Wow, what a mouthful. So, again, what does that mean? These hormones are all directly linked to our brain's ability to focus and memorize. Nicotine, however, causes adrenaline to be released by the kidneys, which will cause your blood pressure to dramatically spike. Once the cognitive effects wear off from nicotine, this spike in adrenaline will cause the user to experience anxiety and crave that dopamine hit again, thus repeating the cycle. Nicotine is one of the hardest chemicals to quit due to its cognitive effects on the brain, and with the rise of vaping and copious amounts of flavors, this level of difficulty only gets harder. Big thank you to our special guest, Dr. Paxie Vreedie, for being a part of A Sound Constitution and sharing your experience around addiction treatment. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule and being part of our show. I'd like to give a big thank you to my co-hosts, Ashley, Cassidy, and Ashley, for sharing information surrounding trauma, smartphone use, and assisting with the VIU interviews. And lastly, I would like to thank our listeners for joining us today and listening to our episode on addiction. For details and show notes for today's episode, or to follow along on what's coming up next this season, check out our Facebook page at A Sound Constitution, our Instagram page at CHLY Sound Constitution, all one word, and our Twitter page at asc.viu. If you have missed parts of this episode or want to listen to more episodes, check out our YouTube page at A Sound Constitution. I hope you enjoyed our episode today, and we will catch you all next week.